Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor, Greg Dooley, and the Pundit, Steve Clark. Men, take the mic.
That's right, it's the Professor and the Pundit on Fantastic Friday on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. I'm Steve Clark, and with me is my partner on the podcast, Greg Dooley, the host of This Week in Michigan Football History.
And the professor of Professor and the Pundit podcast. So what's up, Steve? How you doing? We're live.
We are live on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA the day before Michigan kicks off its season in its quest to three-peat. The three-peat to beat Ohio State, the three-peat to win a Big Ten championship, and possibly, Greg, the first time to win a national championship in 26 years. That is a very good possibility. I'm looking forward to talking about that. I'm very excited for where we're ranked, where people think we have us heading, the amount of information that we have learned about Michigan football over the course of the offseason. Michigan is ready for this. I hope you're ready for it, too.
I'm ready, and I'm just watching you, Steve. You're such a natural in the air chair. It's almost like you've done this before.
A little bit. Gosh, man, it has been nearly 30 years since I've been on the airways at WTKA. April of 1990. Yeah, it was 1990.
As a regular thing.
1994.
Wow.
1994 when I was first hired at WTKA. And now it is nearly 30 years later. At one point, I was hosting the morning show with Jeff Defran before Sam and Ira, and that went on for about 3.5, 4 years, and then went on. And you've made some major changes in your life recently as well.
Yeah, so it's great to be here. I actually just left the University of Michigan campus, where I am actually a teacher, instructor, call myself the professor on campus. I teach 3 classes now, and that started last fall. Where I took over 2 of classes that John U. Bacon created. One, the history of college athletics, kind of a ubiquitous course at Michigan, and also a leadership course. And in the spring, I started a brand new course offered at Michigan called on name, image, and likeness, kind of getting into all those aspects around it. And I'm teaching all 3 now, right now, in the fall. This was our first week.
And you're not like a former high school teacher or elementary ed teacher that has worked his way up to the university level. You have just started this cold but running.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they get to a certain age, they think, well, maybe I should write a book or do this or that. And some people say, well, it would be cool to teach. And I've actually had the experience of being a guest lecturer in some of Bacon's classes over the years. Because many of you know, I write mvictors.com, and it has a history bent, and I love to tell stories and speak to people. And I've done athletic department events and alumni events and all that stuff. And the opportunity came up.
You've been on the Big Ten Network, Greg. Let's not kid people around.
The BTN. With, get this, one of the ones, I did a Big Ten icon series, they call it. One was on Tom Harmon, and one was on Bo Schembechler. And I believe they were both opened by Keith Jackson himself. He did the opening segment of it, and that was an honor. So I've been around a little bit, but I was in corporate America, and I basically quit my job to take this opportunity at University of Michigan, and I haven't looked back. It's only been a year now, but I've got about 200 students across my 3 classes. I just met with several of them in office hours. Maybe some are listening. What's up? I've got 3 awesome classes, and it is exhilarating. It's inspiring what the students bring, and I love it.
So you're pioneering the NIL class, because I don't think anybody was teaching NIL classes a couple of years ago.
No, they definitely were not. They were probably the occasional contemporary issues in college athletics and inequity in college athletics and things like that, but nothing on NIL. And it's more than NIL. Because what we do, and Steve, you know me very well. Steve and I have been friends for a long time. We like to talk about investing in money and things like that. I have a big focus on kind of following the money, right? What's going on? Because frankly, it's the money that is driving a lot that goes on, almost everything right now in big college athletics, down to NIL. So we talk a lot about the big picture, but we take a very, very narrow view, particular of the stakeholders and the issues involved with NIL. And it's fun.
And legislation is always changing, and there's conflicting legislation that is always going on, and there's lots of topics that we've managed to fill the summer. So,
and by the way, there is no textbook, okay?
No.
So I tell the class, like my syllabus says, there is no textbook for this course. You got to watch our learning management system is called Canvas. Watch Canvas. Because it might be an article that was published this morning is what we're going to talk about.
Right, and if they, the kids raise their hand and have some input into it, they might find themselves into the syllabus or quoted in the next lecture.
And there are
you never know.
Believe it or not, all my classes have an athletics bent to them one way or the other, and a good portion of my classes are with student athletes, and many of them. Names you know that I'm not going to share here that everyone on this listening right now knows, but they have deals of their own, they have experience of their own, and I asked them off the record to bring those experiences, good and bad, with the University of Michigan and elsewhere and with companies. I asked them to bring that to the class, which is a really cool element of it.
Finally, I got to tell you, you're not just picking up where somebody left off. You got Santa Ono to speak in your class, and that's one thing in itself. But how many other classes has Santa Ono spoken to at the University of Michigan?
I don't know, but it was his first. So he did a guest lecture. We actually did kind of a Q&A in the history of college athletics. And he came in and he talked about a lot of issues. Again, unfortunately, I can't say all the things he shared, but he talked about his experience and as an administrator and the leader of a school and a big university, because he's been in other places like Cincinnati with big name coaches, and kind of his view of the marriage between athletics and its importance in an academic institution. And he's fantastic. And by the way, on the odd chance that Santa Ono is listening, I am efforting to get President Ono back this fall. I'm working on it, Steve. And Steve, you'll be the first to know if I get President Ono, maybe the second after my lovely wife. But I am working on him. Now, he's been a little busy the last few days. We opened school and Michigan had a little technical issue.
Some with the internet. Did your email get through on the request?
You know what's funny is email worked. Nothing else did. Everything was down at Michigan for 3 days. And by the way,
shut everything down except for my email.
Well, you'd be surprised. So in my former life, I was a chief information officer for a company, and you have to list out what are those tier 1 applications, what can't go down or our business is done. And it's funny, when you ask the leaders of an organization, they often say email. Don't lose my email. So email was fine, but well, yeah, we had a very interesting week. And by the way, speaking of messes on campus, there's a lot of construction. And I am happy to say, for those of you, I know this is a show with an international reach, but a very, very, also a very loyal local audience, especially for game day. State Street in front of Schembeckler Hall and Yost and all that has been closed forever with construction, at least one way. It's open. Yes, it is open. State Street is open on campus, everybody. There you go.
We're still joined by Miz on the other side of the glass, and you can just tell because he's playing the sound effects.
Yeah.
And then he's the one guy who can do it. Miz, thanks for joining us again.
Absolutely. I wanted to hit this one when you mentioned Santa.
Santa's coming to town.
So, I mean, we figured we'd drop that down for him, you know?
Awesome.
Thank you, Miz. We play drops as well in our podcast as well, The Professor and The Pundit. Before I tailed that at the end, as a former CIO, and to share that we know our knowledge of stocks and business, do you think the University of Michigan is going to be switching from CrowdStrike to Palo Alto or Fortinet or something like that?
Well, where are you going with that is that it's a not so dirty secret right now that this was the result of a cyber attack. And Steve, what you're mentioning are some of the leading security providers and companies that I've worked with before, by the way. And yeah, there will be some conversations about our infrastructure moving forward. And yeah, so
right at the beginning of class, this started.
Usually, the fallout and the kind of the analysis of what happened, really trails the next few weeks. But there will be one. And there will be changes made to how we operate IT, because this was a big deal. This would ruin some companies, just so everyone's clear.
Any chance that was started by the Honors College or something like that to prove their worth?
I have no information about this, and I don't want to get involved.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. But it is The Professor and the Pundit. We just finished our first season. We started in May. and working our way up. We're now actually into the football season, which should make things a whole lot easier. So the Professor and the Pundit is available on Spotify. It's available on Apple. It's Google. Wherever you get your podcast is where you can download it from. Thank you. The more you know, the more we make possible.
We've got hundreds of followers. Our listener base has been growing since we launched. By the way, we're backed by a guy named Nick Hopwood, who's familiar on these airwaves.
Good man.
Yeah. Nick is in Peak Wealth Management, has been our title sponsor since the get. And, man, it's been awesome. And also all the help. And, Steve, you have your weekly segment on this show where you get to talk about what we're talking about on our podcast. And it's been a ton of fun. So check it out if you haven't.
So one of the things that we talked about for this Wednesday in the morning that it dropped is Michigan is number 2 in the preseason polls. The last time that happened, I believe, was 1991. And that was a special year because that was a year that Desmond Howard won the Heisman Trophy that year. And they also beat Notre Dame for the first time in 5 years. Two huge victories for Michigan.
You mentioned a couple of years, like 94 when you started here at TKA, and now we're talking about 91. And what I remember was that this was just a golden period, this period, because you're coming off the 1989 basketball championship. Hockey and red started to emerge and go to Frozen Fours. You had the Fab Five come in, right? And, 97 championship team, 96 and 98 hockey championships. You had all this success through this period. It was far from perfect, but it was fantastic. But we were used to competing or winning championships, a lot of them at the time. 91 was special because I was there. I was a student. And what we talked about was just Desmond. And what I like to tell people when they ask me, what was it like to see that guy? And I always tell them this, and I realized that I had a moment, a little bit of presence in the moment, is that everyone in that student section in the stadium knew where the ball was going, Steve. Mm-hmm. They knew where the ball was going on 3rd and 8. And they knew it was going from Elvis Gerback. He was going to find Desmond Howard. The defense knew it. The crowd knew it. The TV audience knew it. And there was nothing anybody could do about it.
No, and especially in the red zone.
Yeah.
Greg, I mean, now, Michigan had talented tailbacks like Ricky Powers and Jesse Johnson and Tyrone Wheatley. I mean, that was a trio of running backs that kind of rivals what Michigan is kind of setting up now in 2023. But when it was inside the red zone, Elvis Gerback was going to pass to Desmond Howard, and there was one of two options. It was either going to be a simple slant play, or it was going to be in the fade in the deep corner.
Yeah.
And the defensive backs knew it, and they could try to double it, whatever. Desmond and Elvis read their keys, threw it to the right place, and it happened all the time. In fact, I keep waiting for another quarterback at Michigan to throw fades into the corner of the end zone, and I don't see it.
We haven't done that a lot.
I don't see it at all.
Yeah, we haven't done that a lot. Yeah, that's interesting. And we're gonna have Nick Baumgartner and Mark Snyder on, and their book, which I've had a chance to read, they talk about the play, the waggle. They call it something different, but it's that tight end counter tight end. By the way, it's something they talk about in the book. Apparently, we always only ran it to the right, which is what I remember.
That is true.
Yeah. So that was a joke. It's like they had both, but they only went right with it, which I love some of the insight in their book. But you're right. We've kind of gotten away from that fade, which, and again, probably the most famous fade is the 1991 Notre Dame catch, which we broke down a little bit on the podcast, which is right up there with the Woodson one-handed interception at Michigan State. And then the punt returns by those two guys that come right to the top of my mind when I think of greatest plays of all time that I've seen.
Sure. Well, I mean, it was certainly the element of surprise in the moment that it happened because Michigan was all about, running. And Gary Mueller was going to change things and be more offensive, be more explosive. You saw what, teams like Florida State, a team that was on the rise at that point in their history. And I think Michigan fans were ready to see an aerial attack. But no one was expecting it with the game sort of on the line. A chance to get, 3. They're going for it on 4th down instead of trying to go up 6 points or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then they decided to pass the ball. And look, if Elvis Gerback's ball was 6 inches further, it's thrown too far. And if it's thrown 6 inches too short, it might have been deflected by the Notre Dame defensive back. But it was a straight, flat-out catch by Desmond Howard, and the crowd went nuts, and it solidified the game. and it made Desmond Howard the solid Heisman Trophy favorite for the rest of the season. It was only week 2.
And we know a lot about that play because a couple things happened. First, the athletic department issued later the headset audio of Gary Moeller talking to Gerback, talking to the players, talking to Jerry Hanlon, and kind of working through what they're going to do on this 4th down. And one of the options was a toss. It was a toss to Ricky Powers, okay, if the defense didn't set up right. The other thing we know is we have John Crick's interview, author John Crick, with Lou Holtz, the coach of Notre Dame at the time, who said he was looking back at it, they had the right defense in. They had the right defense. They had 2 guys and a guy and a safety ready to roll onto Desmond if they tried to pass it or do the hitch, the short one, to get the 1st down. He said they had it covered. But it was a perfect play and a perfect maneuver. Again, inches one way or the other. We know that. And I actually had Gary Moeller sitting in my chair. I was sitting in your chair, Steve, for about an hour. And we broke down every little piece of that headset audio where he explained what Caesar meant, what 29 meant, what Yost meant, all these different calls that you hear on the headset. And it was fascinating. I mean, it's the biggest nerd out I've ever had in my life, but I'll never forget it. And getting to meet and hang out with Gary Moeller.
Yeah, we got an excerpt on this week's Professor and the Pundit podcast, and the full thing is on mvictors.com if you're interested in seeing that. And, of course, the rest of the 91 season fell a little bit short, but the only 2 teams that Michigan lost to were the number 1 team in the nation and the number 2 team in the nation in Florida State and Washington. The Florida State game here was in Ann Arbor, and that was about 2 teams trading haymakers in the first half. And Michigan beat Ohio State, I think 31-3 in that game, and at a time where people were questioning about whether Lloyd Carr should be the defensive coordinator at the time because they were giving up a lot of points halfway through the season. Michigan finished the regular season with 2 Big Ten shutouts, giving up 3 to Ohio State, and I think they were outscoring their opponents in the second half of the season. Not the second half of play clock, but the second half of the season, games 6 through 11, like 190 to 13 or something like that.
Yeah.
So
the Florida State game, I remember that.
There was no problem. There was no problem with Lloyd Carr keeping his job, and it's a good thing because otherwise he probably wouldn't be the head coach of the 1997 team that won the national championship. When we go to break, we're going to talk to the 2 new authors of a fascinating new book that has come out called Mountaintop, the inside story of Michigan's 1997 national title climb, authored by Nick Baumgartner and Mark Snyder. And we're going to be talking to both of them here in just a few moments here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA with Steve Clark and Greg Dooley, the Professor and the Pundit, in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. It is Fantastic Friday on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. Why is it fantastic? Well, for a few reasons. One, we are guest hosting on a day before Michigan football starts its 2023 season, in which they're the number 2 team preseason in the country. And also, it's fantastic because we got the author of the next great book about Michigan. It's called Mountaintop, the inside story of Michigan's 1997 national title climb, authored by Nick Baumgartner, who is a senior writer and columnist for The Athletic, and he co-hosts, Greg, he co-hosts 2 different podcasts.
2?
We're doing one.
I thought
just one now.
But
just one now?
2.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I didn't know that we could do that, especially Steve.
Yeah,
Can
well,
I
it's
break
fine.
off and do?
Does that mean he was censored on one?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that might be one.
which one is still alive? Is it one of these years?
The Lions one is still kicking, yes.
Yeah, one of these years. That podcast is with Chris Burke, and of course Nick has been with the Detroit Free Press and M Live, and then we're also joined by Mark Snyder, former longtime beat writer for the Free Press. Was covering the 1997 team at a time as a student at the Michigan Daily. And, the Wolverines, after decades of dreaming and expecting a national championship, Michigan actually did it in a year where there's a lot of people and pundits didn't expect it, and some were kind of giving up on. Guys, thanks for joining us today.
We're glad to be with you.
Thanks for having us, guys.
This is a perfect timing for this book, not necessarily because it's, on the anniversary, 25 years going into 26, but Michigan is on the cusp of potentially winning it again. And they were not the number 2 preseason team in 1997, were they?
No, not at all. I mean, they were the number 14 team, and that was, to be generous at one point, basically, a lot of these rankings and stuff are based on the personnel. It's how they've done years before, but the personnel, and that team with personnel outside of Charles Woodson, there's a lot of guys who became great names, but they weren't great names at the time.
We had a guest on the morning show This guy, regular guest, his name was Michael Bradley, and I think he was working for the Sporting News when he wrote the article Under the Crumbling Block M. And that served as motivation, I thought, for this 1997 team, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of things that went into that, right? It was like, not only had they become like a laughingstock and a punching line or whatever, and I don't even know if laughingstock's the right word, but they took it so personal, right? Bino Cook making fun of them all the time. They were, Drew Sharp, we talked to Lloyd about some things Drew wrote that shook him up pretty good, right? Like, so it was like a lot of people were sort of all over them. And then the other thing, and I think Mark and I, we talked to a lot of guys about this, that the 96 class was the first one in forever to not win a Big Ten title, was the first one to leave Michigan as seniors without a ring. And it shook a lot of guys that came back, and a lot of guys that even really sort of, Mark, maybe you can correct if maybe you read different, but some guys who kind of thought maybe I would never get shook by that, it shook them even. They were like, man, I don't ever want to go through that. So there was a lot going on there in terms of the result.
Yeah, and adverse circumstances, force people into different situations, right? When that happens, the culture changed after that. I mean, a lot of the guys who were on the 96 team had left because they graduated out or because they ended up transferring or left, like David Bowens, for some other reason or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the culture changed. The guys who became the leaders, there was this group of 5 guys who were the fifth-year seniors, and they kind of took control. None of them were demonstrative people. None of them were vocal, outstanding leaders. But, that group, Glenn Steele, Brian Greasy, Colby Kiefer, some of those guys, they set a tone for that of work. They didn't set a tone of being bombastic or, look at me or I got to get mine for the NFL. It's about we're going to win this. And, I think that set something to beginning. And that kind of matched up with Lloyd a little bit too.
Yeah, and there were 2 other things, guys. And I'm actually quoted in the book talking about the schedule and that preseason poll, like people do, they kind of look at your schedule. The schedule at the time, at the beginning of the season, looked incredibly daunting, right, with the level of teams you had to play. And the other thing was, you mentioned Greasy. Greasy heading into 1997 was not the Greasy we think of him today. From the fans' perspective, he was shaky. We learned the things he was doing and the commitment he made behind the scenes in your great book. But I don't think a lot of people understood that. And many people look at the quarterback. That's one of the reasons Michigan is so highly ranked right now, is because we have what appears to be an experienced quarterback. But it was Greasy, and he needed to show it, because if it wasn't Greasy, it was who? It was going to be Tom Brady, which I think a lot of people forget that too.
And then there was Scott Dreisbach.
Yep.
And if we want to go back a little bit, guys, I mean, there was talk about who was going to start in that Hall of Fame Bowl against Alabama in 1996. And, I thought, according to popular lore, was that whoever, wasn't going to start was not coming back. And that Brian Greasy was, looking at getting out of football altogether.
He actually was. Yeah. He told us when we sat with him, he kind of outlined the whole thing. He was on a bus talking to teammates about it. He met Nick, can talk a little bit about his brother, and he had this meeting with his brother, kind of a moment that changed everything.
Yeah, so
they had dinner. It was somewhere in Miami, I think, like right after the Outback Bowl. Was it the Outback Bowl? I always get this wrong.
It was called something else. I think it was the Hall of Fame. Maybe it was the Outback at the time.
I think it was Outback at that time. I got that one right. They played the Hall of Fame earlier, whatever it was. But anyway, so Brian, he'd beaten Ohio State in the finale. He'd played not great in the bowl game, and he, sort of had all this stuff that he felt like he probably overcame with, personal things and all this, but was also sort of just like, I'm done with football. The GW, he was going to go to GW, had it all set up, like had everything ready to go, and had dinner with, I think his brother Jeff is what it was, in Miami, somewhere down there right after the game. And he was like, Brian, what are you doing, man? Like, you have like your whole life to just be a suit or whatever. Like, you can work at Greenpeace or whatever it is when you're done with all this. Like, you cannot let them run you out of here. Like, you have to go back. And, Brian, I think he told us, Mark, right? Like maybe a day or two it took him after that even to go over it in his mind, because he'd said to himself, because I think he knew, the other thing, Steve, you mentioned it, Tom Brady's right there nipping at his heels. People don't realize, I don't think, how close that really was, the competition that in 97. You can look at Lloyd's notes even, and there's times where he mentions Brady was our best quarterback that day. But, Brian, I think I have to be all in because somebody's going to come take it. And there was a different attitude at the time to be quarterback at Michigan than we have seen probably since Tom Brady left. I mean, that was probably the end of that line. And everything sort of changed from there. But that was the read I got on Brian. And when he decided to come back, he was like all guns blazing.
Yeah, and you mentioned those notes, though. Can I get into that real quick? Because we dove, of course, right into the team and the backdrop. But the fact is, like, if you take a step back from this book, to me, it's really kind of a tribute to Lloyd Carr and the man he was. And you mentioned those notes. And I got to say, and I've talked to both of you about this, but one thing you had access to was Lloyd had a particular technique of recording notes and getting those published. And it sounds like you guys got access to all of them. Can you explain what I'm talking about a little bit, and maybe how you got access to this stuff? Because can I add this? I feel like we knew a little bit about Lloyd and the kind of the man he was and the leader he was a little bit off the field. We didn't know a lot about him like on the field and how he interacted with the players and what he did. Whereas I look at someone like Bo, I feel like people feel like they know what Bo was like, the coach, what he was like. But we didn't have that with Lloyd. Now we do because of your book. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was kind of an ongoing conversation. There's a conversation I had with Lloyd, a number of years ago about these notes and kind of what they were and just kind of cursory. The intent of it was because he's a different kind of guy, because he's a teacher. When you're a teacher, Greg, like you, before you go into your class, you get your lesson plans and you get everything and you have to prepare. You can't just roll up there and just talk in front of students,
right.
And that's what Lloyd, so he had this preparation background. So he knew every day he was going to meet with his staff. So what did he have to do? He had to be prepared. Other coaches, they just roll in there and they just shoot from the hip. Well, he wanted to be prepared. So how do you be prepared? When he's watching practice the day before, he had a little tape recorder with technology. He talked into it. When he was done, he would give it to a staffer. They would type up all the notes, and it was all. And it's interesting. You'd think it'd be all football, but it was not. It was a stream of consciousness, pinball, everything. I tweeted this the other day actually. At the first practice, one of the first notes of 1997 is all of the lights in this ceiling need to be replaced.
Yeah, exactly. It's little mundane details like, remind me to tell the kids about John Heisman, right? The famous coach, or tell so-and-so to stop or to clean up the weight room, Right. I thought it was just great.
Right. The intent was for staff meetings. That was the intent, to be able to make the corrections with the staff and then the staff make the corrections with the players. So it's not all coming from Lloyd, and there's a, top-down philosophy with that. But as we went into them, it's really amazing because, we wrote this 400-page book. When we first wrote it, it was 600 pages, so we had to cut it down. With just on the notes, we could have written a whole nother book. There is so many details in there, and they're great because it really gives a mindset about Lloyd and kind of you learn about him.
Can you share anything funny or that maybe didn't make it into the book that came up in the notes and you kind of talked to Lloyd, or maybe hit the cutting room floor but was a funny thing that he wanted to share?
I'm trying to think. There were several, I don't know how much got in, Mark, but there were several instances where he was like sending guys up to the bridge. Like, there are people on that bridge
watching practice.
We're playing Notre Dame this week. There are Notre Dame people in here. And he's saying this he would say this in the middle of camp. He would say in training camp in August, he'd be like, there's Notre Dame people. I saw somebody walking around in a Notre Dame shirt.
Oh my gosh.
And some better be on the bridge.
So Bo was convinced that someone would rent the house right across when you could go right over that wall. And
that's
now
a great story, actually.
Yeah, now this year, the team, do you guys know, on their little outdoor area, they put up like 40-foot tarps all the way around to prevent such a thing.
They got money.
Yeah.
They got money now. But what Nick's talking about, with trying to get those guys off the bridge and all, people who were walking by and peeing, because it was just a chain link fence and they'd peer through and stuff like that. So Lloyd would send the managers out. And the managers, it's public property. They can stand there all they want. And so there's a covering. So the managers had to get creative, student managers. And so what they did is they took out gloves and hats and swag, and they said, okay, I'll give you some gloves from a player or whatever. Just go away. I just got to make the guy happy or whatever. And so it just became like part of their routine is trying to persuade these guys. You think you're a football manager and you're tending to practice. No, you're sitting there trying to get people who are just regular people on the sidewalk.
Oh my God, I
And-
love it.
And
I
I'm
love
here
it.
to tell you that Sam and myself are selling a lot of those items on eBay, and we appreciate the student managers for doing that. We were the guys.
Someone's got to make money.
I think my favorite thing about the notes is how it shows, like, Lloyd was such a meticulous, detailed-oriented person at a time when details were not, I mean, really that respected. I think Lloyd had told the guys at one point, I don't know if it was at the 25th or it was maybe even at their 15th or 10th reunion, the 97 team, he told them, you guys made it harder to play here, all of you. You made it harder to play here, and you made it harder to coach here. You've raised the standard of everything that has to be done, right? And I always thought Lloyd, to him, like, he raised it right then and there, because he takes over for a guy like Gary Moeller, who by all measures is a football genius, who could coach any position on any day of the week, could probably coach the whole team by himself, but was also very poorly organized. Practices would always run long. They were, if it was supposed to go 90 minutes, sometimes it would go 3 hours. He'd stop it right at the end and be like, nope, start the whole thing over. This sucked. I'm not doing it. And it was just very scattershot and very like, I'll handle it. I'll do it myself. All the pressure on me. And Lloyd is the first coach to ever bring periods to Michigan, practice periods. Obviously the notes, that's something he took from Bear Bryant. And it's like, you just look at his entire tenure. Obviously that season, they got every ounce they could out of that roster, which is a really good roster, but every team Lloyd had for the most part, in those really good years.
Greg and I were coaching Pee Wee football for a while, and we were doing the same things. We see, things are regimented. It's like this 15-minute block, we're going to do this, and this 15-minute block, we're going to do that. And
Sure.
We didn't have
Planning.
We didn't have assistants, placing out cones. So as coaches, we were literally running the cones out. We're robbing our kids time and reps if we walk out and did that.
I don't think people realize after Woodson in 97, Al Borges told us this. Other staffs flew in here in 98 and were like, how the hell did you schedule practice to get this guy on the field for however many snaps it was? People were just blown away. Everybody tried it. R.W. McQuarters or some other guys. Freddie Mitchell, I think, was the guy Al was talking about.
That was
Everybody tried it. Nobody could pull it off. And it was like, I remember asking Lloyd about that. And he's like, we just had a really good staff that talked to each other a lot and shared as much as they could possibly share. And it was organization.
The book is Mountaintop, the inside story of Michigan's 1997 national title climb, authored by Nick Baumgartner and Mark Snyder, Greg.
Amazon, where else, guys? You guys have a website, I believe?
Yeah, Michigan1997book.com. Pretty easy.
Cool. So,
and at the MDN right now.
Oh, yes.
MDN too, yeah.
Yep.
Scott Hurth at the MDN is all excited. Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. So a couple things you guys must have balanced, and I can get why this book could have been 600, 800, 1,000 pages. You guys did a great job of two things. A lot of things, but two things in particular is that if people are like, well, yeah, I remember the 97 season. It was an important part of my life, and I remember all the games. You guys did a really good job of picking out the most important things and the insight from the games, not giving us 15 pages of what happened in the Baylor game. You guys got right to it. You talked a cool story. The other thing you did was there's so many people involved with this team, from the student managers, the coaches, obviously, to the players, obviously, to media people. You found that right balance of introducing these characters, but not necessarily giving us a 15-page chapter of what Tom Brady did in the offseason that year, right? You found that balance, and I imagine that was incredibly hard, but a huge compliment to you guys. Is there anything at this point that you'd almost like say, boy, if there were a bonus edition or, an extra chapter that you would throw in there that's come out of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, detail. Even like there are a million stories, but detail. And Greg, you can even speak to this because you know how much time you spent with this and how much got in the book. You did. I mean,
well, I'll tell you, I spent an hour on the phone with these guys answering a bazillion questions, and I got a 10-word little quote.
That's in there though,
which is
but
about my worth,
really,
by the way. Yeah.
And we did that with everyone. I mean, I remember sitting with Steve Hutchinson for an hour and a half just on the street, and he's telling me about his whole life and all this different stuff. And Steve Hutchinson, NFL Hall of Famer, and we got a little bit in about his backstory, but very little. It's just that to do justice to all of these people and to show, and basically that's the micro, but the macro is that we're showing that all of these people mattered. The managers mattered, the walk-ons mattered, Charles Woodson mattered, Tom Brady mattered. They all had different roles, but everyone, meant something. And that's Lloyd. That's what Lloyd told us on day one. Everyone matters. He showed that, and that's why it turned out the way it did, because we wanted to reflect what this was at the time.
Yeah, and
we were like,
go ahead, Nick.
I think we were like a couple months in to actually maybe writing, and Lloyd had asked something along those lines because he was very worried the whole time. Like, you have to make sure that all these guys are represented in here because that's what the team was. And he asked somewhere along the way, "Are we doing this? And is this how it's going to be? Are you guys really doing this?" And I think we showed him, Mark. Like, I talked to Rob Sweat, and we could have wrote a whole chapter on Rob Sweat. He had so much great stuff to say, but I essentially tried to boil down, Rob Sweat's biography and put it toward he ran down that kick, that PAT on Katzenmoyer in the Ohio State game. And Rob told such a great story in that moment where it was and it defined sort of his essence as a player. So I think the hard part was sort of finding every guy's moment. Like Tate Shansky had a moment, and we had to find out what it, you know what I mean? Like every guy had some sort of thing that happened that year, and that's your sort of entry point in. But yeah, no, I mean, there were so many guys. Chris Floyd, we could have written about a book about him. Gittleson, I mean, that guy. That's one of my favorite interviews I probably ever sat in on, and maybe ever will.
Gittleson,
he is a fascinating person.
You mentioned
and part of that's too. He doesn't talk to people. Mike's really a private person, and the fact that he talked to us, we appreciated greatly.
Yeah, he was amazing.
It really gave us a lot of insight into the mentality of everything that happened.
One of the coolest insights, and you mentioned the Ohio State game, and of course there's all these assistant coaches, right? We got to know Jim Herman a little bit, but something happened before that Ohio State game that is indicative of the kind of research and you guys did. But can you tell the story about what happened before the Ohio State game? And this did make it in the book, obviously.
Nick, you want to?
Yeah. I mean, so we had to confirm this with a few different people, but we did in fact get it done because it was so sort of outlandish. I don't remember it might have been Draper who told us the first.
Yeah, Scott
Draper told us the first time, and Scott was amazing too. By the way, he had all of his notes and everything. But so day of the game, they're at Campus Inn, right, which is now whatever it is called.
Graduate.
Graduate. So they're Campus Inn, and they're getting ready to go, and they get on the bus, they go down. Everybody's, jacked up. They get off the bus. They get into the stadium. Herman goes to his locker. It's about an hour and a half, whatever it is. I think less than that even. Maybe at this point
close.
when he got to his locker, it was 20 minutes maybe to kick off. And he realizes, I don't have my game plan. I don't have it. I don't have my game plan. It's back at the hotel downtown.
So all his notes, the strategy, all the calls, everything he needs.
Everything. The whole call for the Ohio State game is at his hotel on his desk in the thing.
Biggest game in 50 years. Yeah.
And traffic, traffic at Michigan Stadium at noon on it's just 11:50 more or less what it was. It was 10-15 minutes for the kickoff. And they had to get the police, Draper had to call Campus Inn, get a police escort ready. And he's like, you got to get the elevators held. I got to be and they timed it or whatever. He ran up there, went up to his suite and found it under Herm's dip cup, grabbed it, brought it back. And he gave it to him on the field. You can actually, I think, see
Absolutely.
Draper running up to Herman on the sideline
really?
after the ball has been kicked. And Herm's
amazing.
clipping it to his belt. And now he says he clips it to his belt. He never leaves his room.
25 years.
He hasn't
25 years, never. Right.
He was awesome,
That is absolutely amazing.
Well, and that's part of it too. Herm was so great. And these guys, who have these mystiques, and you guys, maybe younger people don't know it, but you guys who lived through it, all these guys were kind of caricatures, right? At the time,
right.
This guy's the gruff guy. This guy's Lloyd's the, snaps at everyone and all this stuff. Gittleson's quiet. No one knows who he is. He's this mystery, Yoda or whatever. And we got to know all of them and realized maybe it's the perspective of time. Maybe it's 25 years and they want to share the stories and they want to show that they're human. But they did. They all showed us who they were. And that really was impressive to us. And we wanted to reflect that because these people are all well-rounded people. Now, they didn't show it necessarily at the time, and they were fine with that, or maybe Lloyd didn't let them show it at the time. There's something going on there. But, really that, and like Herm, he's a perfect example. Everyone thought he was distant for all of these years. And we talked to him, and he's laughing, and he's joking, and he's busting on people when we talk to him. And he's just, a great, great dude just to kind of get his whole background, his ethos. And I was impressed because I followed them for so long. I never had too close. I mean, I talked to Jim once in a while, but never as much as we did that night, and it changed the whole perspective.
He cared so much. He cared so much about Michigan football. Like, that's what come across when he was here, man. It meant the world to him, and it still kind of does, I think, in a lot of ways. He came back and he was at the reunion there for the tunnel thing with Lloyd, which was cool to see as well.
Yeah, Jim, great story about him. Didn't get in the book. Okay, we'll go back a little bit. When he was a player, he was a really good player. I mean, not great, but he was pretty good. He left. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He was going to go do something else. And then it kind of came that he wanted to work for free as an assistant. And Bo was like, cool, yeah, we'd like that. You're great, et cetera. But he couldn't work for free. He needed to get paid. So what did he do? He took some kind of like job, quote unquote, with Domino's Farms, and Monahan hired him. And and what did he hire him to do? Create a rival award to the Heisman Trophy. This is Monahan's idea. And this was what Herm was going to be doing. This young guy just out of college, you're going to create a rival to the Heisman Trophy. And it's Michigan that time, the Heisman was like a fantasy. No one had won it, in all these years since Harmon or whatever. And he did a little of that. It never went anywhere, and he just kind of hung around. Eventually, he got hired and became a GA and stuff like that. But that's the only reason Jim Herman even stayed around those years, was because of Domino's Farms paying his salary, because he was being for free, and Bo wasn't going to pay him at all.
Amazing.
And Tom Monahan to this day is still involved in football, because his Ave Maria University out in Immokalee, Florida, is playing this weekend, this Saturday, against Lawrence Tech University. The Ave Maria University Gyrenes. They're
unbelievable.
Yeah, they're all coming
back around.
It does. Again, Mountaintop is the name of the book. Nick Baumgartner and Mark Snyder are our guests. One of the things that may be hard to believe at the time, because 25 years has passed, and we talked about Michigan not being a highly ranked team or a team that was considered a national championship quality team, I don't think people still gave Michigan any credence or credit as a potential champion until they beat Penn State, which was right before the Ohio State game. There was the Wisconsin game in between.
Yep.
But I don't think anybody was really giving Michigan a whole bunch of thought, even though they were steadily rising due to the fact that they were undefeated. But they said they're going to go into Happy Valley, and I think Beano Cook said they were going to lose by 5 or 6 touchdowns or so.
Yep. Yeah, we lost Nick here, it looks like. But Nick has a great theory on that, and I'll just kind of speak for him until he comes back. Nick's theory on that. Do you want to talk about that? Nick had a theory. Oh, you're back. Okay. About Penn State, about your regional to national, and that game changed there.
Yeah, I think that game to me is like one of the most important games that's ever happened in Michigan football, like in the history of the program. I think to me that when they won that game in '97 in such dominant fashion, and you have to remember how good Penn State was at the time and how dominant they were and what they were thought of nationally. When they did that, it changed everything. That was right around the time that Nike.
Oh, we lost Nick again. If we get Nick back, Mark, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this real quick, Mark, in case Nick comes back.
And to me,
let's see if we can get Nick's audio straightened out there, Miz. But let me ask you real quick, the most surprising win actually happening to the fan base, seeing it happen at the time, the 1997 Penn State win or the 2021 Michigan win over Ohio State? What was more surprising of the two?
Oh, I'd say the 2021, just because the Michigan fans have been beaten down for so long. When 97 happened, I mean, they're a little underrated, but they had pulled some big wins. They had done some things, and they had their moments. But I think that in 2021, it was the kind of thing where this is like the thing that we deal with Michigan fans all the time, and they don't have any perspective, the younger fans. They don't. I mean, 8-4 was like the death knell at that time, right, Steve? I mean, you remember like 8-4. How 8-4? This is terrible. We need to fire Lloyd Carr. And now, after 20 years in the wilderness, I mean, look, Michigan still hasn't been in the Rose Bowl since 2004 season or something like that. It's just the perspective, and that they maybe would never beat Ohio State again. They never did. And so 21, I think there was a euphoria to it. Was it a better win? I don't know, but I think it was probably more, satisfying, unexpected in the moment. And then the Penn State thing, I think that the thing about the Penn State thing was not that they won, it was how they won. It was that it was so enthusiastic. It was so dominant. It was so crushing, the fact that they whipped them from the first play. We wrote about that in the book, that Glenn Steele just busted through and, knocked them out, and then went straight from there. and they dominated and they rolled, and the fans went crazy afterwards, running into Bollinger's house. And that's what made the dominance of that game was really the most interesting thing.
Nick, we got your audio back, I think. Do you want to carry on in your discussion about 1997 and the legitimacy of Michigan before that game and how it changed after that game?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we know Michigan was a national program and has been forever, all the way back to the Bo days. But I mean, I think college football became a global behemoth sort of after 97, and Michigan, that team came along at the right time, and that game happened at the right time. And like Mark said, as dominant as they were, it was, and with Woodson scoring a touchdown and then winning the Heisman, and it's like nobody was like them. They went from a national whatever to a global brand. The Fab Five, of course, factors into that, but to me, Michigan becomes what Michigan is today after the 97 team wins the national title. If that doesn't happen, there's no promise that we're sitting here today looking at them. I mean, probably, right? But there's no promise that we're sitting here today looking at them as comfortable as they are with their stature and status within the sport of college football.
Yeah, and Steve, also, just to piggyback on that a little bit, that season, obviously, it was great, it was landmark, but it gave Lloyd Carr the job. It gave him contract, gave him another contract, and then he won 4 more Big Ten titles. We saw what happens when after Lloyd left, and then they got a different coach. Well, if they had made a different hire after Lloyd left, and they had fired Lloyd after 97, didn't go the way they wanted, well, then who do they hire? Do they get 4 more Big Ten titles? Do they extend the Bo era for, through 2007? Yeah. There's no guarantees on it.
He'll never come back here, I mean, like all of it. I think a lot of it, Lloyd stabilized the program, and so did the 97 team. And it's very under talked about or not talked about. They were in bad shape when Gary Mueller left.
One thing I teach in my class is that there's these eras of college football, and they're defined by these great moments, but they usually end bad or in turmoil. And I think that was one of those pivots, just as you guys pointed out.
And how about Charles Woodson winning the Heisman Trophy? And what that's done to not only Charles Woodson, but the face of Fox Sports, always coming into Michigan Stadium. That still resonates to this day. Without that Heisman Trophy, is he on Fox? Is he at Michigan games as much? Whatever. I do know one thing that still burns everybody britches is everybody in Tennessee is still upset about Peyton Manning. Now, I remember there was a Knoxville station. It was a Super AM station, and I actually listened to it in the crackle the night that Heisman Trophy winner Charles Woodson took that trophy. And the host was beyond unprofessional. All the callers and their conspiracy theories came in to the worst degree. There's some somewhat legitimate things that make you question, but these people were completely insane the night that Peyton Manning lost. Talk about that for a moment before we wrap up.
Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, well, if you saw the excerpt of the story in The Athletic yesterday, it's on the Athletic site now. It talks about the whole Heisman experience. But Charles, when we talked to him, he sensed, it growing, and it was something they wanted to do, and it was something they always wanted to do, that Michigan was just reticent to kind of do the promotion. But Charles made it to the point where they had to do it. They had to make him available. And it was after, as they were going, they had them. Everyone knows the Michigan State game. Charles makes the pike interception, the one that no one's ever seen before. Except his friends and all the players. Like, we saw that stuff all the time in practice. But he makes the interception. He goes in there, and Bruce Motti, who we all know is the great PR director
and love
for so many years, says to Lloyd Carr afterwards. He says, like, Lloyd is always the first one in the press conference. Lloyd would go up there, players come after. He held Lloyd back. He says Charles takes the podium first. Charles got to go up there, and that he says this is when our Heisman campaign starts. And as it changed, I mean, there was really, this was Peyton Manning blew a game early in the year to Florida. He dug himself a hole, so it kind of opened it up. So there were circumstances that opened it up. But at the same time, Charles took advantage of every opportunity there was. Offense, defense, and then obviously the special teams in the biggest moment.
And he became a big star. And by the way, there's a couple celebrity stories in the back. Al Bundy at O'Neill visited at the Rose Bowl, which is But by the way, he played football for Jerry Hanlon, which I did not know. Yep. The other thing is, get this, Charles, Marcus Ray, and a couple other guys played hoops with Snoop Dogg on their trip out to California on the sly. Marcus tried to get Snoop a sideline pass. Lloyd shut it down. There's some stories like that in the back. It's awesome.
Well, Nick, I looked in the media guide for the Lions a long time ago and saw Ed O'Neill was drafted by the Lions, and it had made me think, was it that guy? Now it's a different Ed O'Neill, but it's certainly
no. He actually got it. He got into Steelers camp, I think, at one point.
Something like that.
Just didn't work out. Yeah.
Bundy,
Player,
the legend.
4 touchdowns in one high school game.
Well, Fred, we got a great story there. I don't know if it made it in, but Fred Jackson kept calling him Al Bundy.
Yeah.
He goes, no, my name's Ed O'Neill. He goes, I don't care. I'm calling you Al Bundy.
I'm gonna call you Al
Damn
Bundy.
right.
He's like, I don't think he liked it. I don't know. Some guys were like, I don't know how much he liked it. We didn't care.
As we wrap up, I got to say, Sports Talk 1050 WTKA and on our WWWHD2 Ann Arbor, the ticket that gets our legal ID in. The Heisman Trophy, I think Peyton Manning didn't win it because he lost to Florida. And it was something he could never do. He had 4 years to beat Florida. He couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Stats is one thing, but you need a moment, and you need to make that moment in a big game. There's plenty of stat guys who don't win anything, but as long as you can arguably say that you're the best at your position and you're the signature guy on your team, all you need is that moment. And Woodson had 2 of them, the Michigan State one and the punt return on the same side of the field, going the same direction as Desmond Howard did 6 years earlier. I mean, that absolutely had to be do it. But,
Absolutely. But
that was the greatest Heisman class ever, by the way. That was the best one ever. Moss, Peyton,
yeah, Moss.
Wilson, and
Ryan Leaf.
Yeah. One thing, just real quick on that. It's so funny because Tennessee got a little bit of revenge. I mean, at least there's some conspiracy theory that Phil Fulmer was one of the coaches who flipped his vote at the end and to give Nebraska the coach's title. He won't admit to it. I know the Athletic talked to him a couple years ago and he refused to admit to it, but he wouldn't deny it either. So, one of those great conspiracies that all the Michigan people, they have their feelings on it.
Third or fourth, right? It wasn't even first or second. It was like third or fourth.
And that was enough to tip the scales. Yep.
Yeah. Mountaintop again by Nick Baumgartner and Mark Snyder. You have a forward from Lloyd Carr, so you definitely have his endorsement as well as his notes, apparently. And it's got an endorsement from Rich Eisen and Kirk Herbstreit, who, by the way, you may not believe it, has a deep appreciation for Michigan football and the rivalry for Ohio State. Make no mistake about that, Greg.
And a giant endorsement from the professor sitting right here. It's a fantastic book for the nerd type fans to new fans to really understand this without saying some of the minutiae that you need, but the stories are fantastic. And you really, really gave a wonderful tribute to a great man in our community, Lloyd Carr. Well done, guys.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
We will be right back with our next guest and more topics here on The Professor and the Pundit on a fantastic Friday on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. Can you feel the excitement, Ann Arbor? Michigan football is ready to start in less than 24 hours. It's quest to three-peat. It's quest for a third straight Big Ten championship. It's quest to beat Columbus and those Ohio State dreaded Buckeyes for the third consecutive season. Can you feel it, Greg?
Yeah, I can feel it. I can feel people reaching for their maize. I can feel people trying to figure out where Peacock is on their TV. I can feel it,
How can I
Steve.
record this game?
I can feel it in my plums, Steve. I can feel it.
Feel it deep down in my plums.
What are we going to do? Is Peacock going to make this available whenever you want it after the game so that you can look at it like a show? Or is it one-time airing, that's it, you'll never see it again?
Will it re-air? I doubt it because we're all used to that, right? So some people will probably, I assume the Big Ten network will have the Big Ten in 60, right? The 60 so later.
Maybe.
But that's a few days after the end, maybe.
Maybe there's something we don't know about. They're not getting authorization to do Big Ten in 60.
There are 3 people listening right now that don't know what we're talking about. And I'm sorry to tell you and inform you that the game is on Peacock. Now, if you don't know what that means, we're not going to talk about it here. I think most people have figured this out now. But there will be some people on Saturday going, honey, Alexa, Siri, what channel is Peacock? I've got all these channels. Which one of them is Peacock?
None
of them?
There is no channel.
I know this, Steve.
It's a stream thing.
Is it like a Netflix? Is it like a Hulu?
Exactly, it is.
But here's the thing that's going to stink. If you're used to watching games where you at a break can just flip to the next game after a push of a button, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to sign out and then get out of the streaming portion process, go back to your cable or your satellite TV, find the game, and then by the time you've done that, you've got to disconnect so that you can rehook up with the streaming. Hey, whatever it is, I'm not too mad about it because Michigan football is going to be playing. You and I are both going to be there.
Yes.
To witness it firsthand. So super excited. I hope everybody's super excited about it too. This is a team that is ranked number 2 in the preseason, hasn't been that way since 1991. And we've certainly been following around what else is going on in the Big Ten. And the Big Ten actually started action last night with a thriller in Minnesota between two teams that could not score. And it wasn't necessarily because of stunning defensive play either. It was okay play.
Yeah.
But once again, Nebraska, I'm going to steal a phrase from Sam, wet the bed again.
They did.
Again.
They did. And not that I would have watched that game anyway, by the way. I know there was other games on, and the Florida-Utah game was on, but it was a blowout. But I'm a conference guy, and people talk about this conference realignment. So that's where I was glued. I watched the whole thing. And once again, Steve, Nebraska gets the gooner at the end of the game. By the way, I thought Minnesota should have went for 2 and tried to win the game with a minute left. When they got the penalty on the extra point, declined, take the penalty, take the points off the board and go for 2. They didn't. Maybe because they probably knew not only recent history, but a lot of history. Sure enough, punched the ball out of the Nebraska ball carriers, gobbled it up, and won the game. And they cut those to those Nebraska fans, Steve. And right now, I am feeling bad for them. Do you feel bad for these people?
Not
Why
at
not?
all. Not at all. They
Because
rank. You know what? You have the mood index on M Victors. I may start creating the Schadenfreude index, taking misery and taking joy in other people's misery. At the top of the list is probably Michigan State, followed by Ohio State. I have no love lost for Notre Dame. Equally so, if not more, for Penn State. And Nebraska is definitely on this list. I don't know where 3, 4, and 5 rank, but Nebraska is very high up on my Schadenfreude list, and I take great pleasure in their misery.
Yes, and you mentioned the mood index. Steve, that is actually part of it. It is your emotional state. How are you feeling this Saturday? Well, great. Notre Dame already lost. Penn State's losing. I feel great. Yeah. That is part of the mood. But they lost again. And it wasn't a Scott Frost team who we all couldn't stand for all the reasons, including our previous guests in that 1997 controversy, which we really didn't get into a lot.
Scott Frost isn't dead, but his spirit lived on in last night's game.
He did. But Matt Rule, so I'm thinking, this guy seems cool. He gave a cool little sideline interview. Seems like a normal guy. He gave great answers. Kind of like him. Okay. Got loyal Nebraska fans. Pretty cool fan base. Hey, what's not to like? No. Again, those cuts to those poor people. I feel bad. I'm taking a shovel and I'm pounding it on top of their heads. Okay.
Those Husker heads that they wear, I'm pounding a shovel on top of it. I'm happy for it. I'm all there for it. Minnesota beat Nebraska 13-10 last night. With a 7-point lead and in control late in the game, they fumble in Minnesota territory out of nowhere. They fumble it. In Minnesota territory, they're about ready to ice this game because they had control of the game. How does Nebraska's defense respond? Well, they start off with a face mask penalty.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they gave up their only touchdown of the game. Both of those were on 4th down. So they did everything right from downs 1, 2, 3. But on 4th down, they commit a face mask penalty that was 15 yards in an automatic and then gave up the game-winning touchdown, which, by the way, that touchdown grab was absolutely amazing. Was it one-handed? Was it behind his back? Was it some sort of acrobatic thing? Well, it was kind of acrobatic in a way. But the idea that, it also explains the rule. You can't have just one foot in. It's got to be the first foot in. And he knew that. So he not only knew that he had to drag that foot inside, which clearly he did because those rubber pellets are
Yeah.
skyrocketing up. But he had to extend his right heel up so that his front foot wouldn't touch down out of bounds first. If that front foot touched out of bounds first, it's an incomplete pass on 4th down. Nebraska takes over. You get the touchdown. Nebraska still has 2.5 minutes to work with, and they're moving down the field. And Jeff Sims throws in his 3rd pick of the game.
Yeah.
And then Minnesota just moves right down the field, something they hadn't been doing much of all in the second half. And they were playing it safe. There's 6-yard outcuts. That's all it was. And they got into field goal range and won the game as time expired. And you go back to the way the first half ended between Nebraska and Minnesota. Nebraska's on the 1-yard line. There's 30 seconds left on the clock. They've got timeouts. And they decide they're going to no huddle and run it in immediately. Why? Why do you do that? Well, the stress of all of that caused a false start penalty on Nebraska. Because it was within the final minute, there was the 10-second runoff.
Yep.
They had to use their final timeout for that. So they have no timeouts. The ball is sitting on the 1-yard line, and they decide to pass the ball because if they run it and don't get in, they get nothing. But they got nothing anyway because, once again, Jeff Sims, the new transfer quarterback from Georgia Tech at Nebraska, throws an interception in the end zone.
Straight to a dude.
I mean, horrific.
Yeah.
And it keeps happening to Nebraska.
Let me ask you, is there anything that you saw that makes you worried about, concerned about Minnesota or Nebraska?
Neither right now. But at the same time,
For Michigan, of course.
I'm tepid because it is everybody's first game.
Yeah.
It is everybody's first game. So, things aren't smooth. There was a lot of things I liked about Minnesota. One of the things that I could see was that, they talk about Minnesota throwing the ball a little bit more, but they seem to be all throwing underneath and crosses. And that's something that after a while you're going to be able to figure out. Eventually, Callie McManus is going to have to throw deep to be able to keep defensive honest. And Nebraska's kind of, they have a running quarterback, and that's what he's going to do. And clearly, since he's passing the ball with 3 picks, he's probably going to run more now than he is going to pass. That's defendable, too.
Yeah.
The defenses are above average, but I also expected Minnesota and Nebraska to be like the 6th or 7th best team in the Big Ten. But am I fearful of that? Other than the fact that Michigan has to go on the road and win a big game at each of those venues, that's probably the bigger obstacle.
I thought their defenses were pretty good too. I thought they had a lot of energy, but I didn't leave there worried about anything. But speaking of first games, this was the first game I watched really in its entirety and kind of got to see that running clock, that new rule, Steve, right? Which is probably the biggest rule change coming in that fans can expect if they can find the game on Peacock and watching the stadium, that they're only going to stop the clock on first downs in the last 5 minutes, the first half and the end of the game.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
It's the last 2 minutes.
Okay, last 2 minutes. So, in other words, the game duration should be a little compressed. The number of plays should be reduced. We'll see.
Right.
We'll see the net of it. But Steve, your reaction and you feel like fans' reaction wasn't really positive about this because the commercials haven't changed, right?
Right.
They still got to work in that. And by the way, in that Minnesota game, if you watch the first half, there was a long drive with no commercials, and they squeezed a bunch in at the end of the first quarter, and then a bunch like kickoff, change, kickoff, another, ball possession, another timeout, maybe a double. I don't know if they can do doubles. It seemed like there was a really long one.
So the gameplay ratio to commercial ratio gets narrowed down even further. And as a fan watching at home or in the stadium, you just start feeling that it's 50-50. It isn't 50-50, but it starts feeling more like it. And it gets to be more like the NFL because they don't do that. Now, for people who are old, it used to be that not only did the clock stop on every first down, it didn't start again until the snap. It hasn't been that way for years. They don't even wait for the chain gang to put their chains down in place. Ball is marked ready for play. It's 7 to 10 seconds, and it's go time. So it's maybe not as bad as you think or the way you remember it back in the 70s and 80s. Still, what I think it does is if your team comes out flat and just not there and still trying to figure out the wrinkles the other team threw at you that surprised you, it's going to give you less time.
A smaller window to close that gap.
To figure that out.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a chance that more upsets could happen as a result of a fast start by a surprise team. Also, Michigan takes great pride in the fact that they're going to mow their opponents down and wear them out. And sometimes we don't see that until the fourth quarter. Well, we're not eliminating a full 15 minutes of play here with this clock, but it's maybe a possession or two where maybe they're not wearing them out as fast.
Yeah, wearing them out. So there's game strategy involved. We'll see how it goes. It's funny you mentioned the NFL. It's probably one reason, even though I love to watch the Lions, I kind of watch Red Zone because Red Zone doesn't really have commercials, and it just goes through live action. And if there's something going on with the Lions that I need to watch, I go over to the network coverage of it. But you find out and know. But I don't have that option with Michigan football. I'm not watching any other game. I'm watching everything that happens.
As you said it, I was thinking maybe they can come up with the Big Ten Red Zone, but they won't because they spread out the games so much.
Yeah, well, we'll see. If they have 20 teams, maybe they can
pull
you
have
off.
18, 20 teams, maybe you could pull off a Big Ten Red Zone.
Yeah, so
that'd be nice.
There are a couple other new things in the stadium. So there's the new scoreboards for anyone who's not in town. These massive new scoreboards with new audio system, new LED lights, which we probably won't see at a noon game, but we'll see it maybe next week or definitely the week after. And what else? Oh, a couple anniversaries, 125 years of the Victors in our first Big Ten championship, which are the same thing. Louis Elbel wrote the Victors following our first Big Ten championship in 1898. This is the 125th anniversary of that this season. That'll be a thing. And I know the marching band has a bunch of surprises ready to go. So,
finally, because I'm not sure we're going to have a whole lot of time to go lift because we have a couple of great guests that are coming up to finish up our hour number 2 here on the Professor and the Pundit on Fantastic Friday on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. But where do you think Michigan is going to be the Big Ten champions? And obviously, other than Ohio State, who do you think is a threat?
Well, the games I'm worried about are Michigan State. And if people are surprised when I say that, I'm a historian. And Michigan State plays us so tough no matter what the circumstances are. Whether we're number one, which I saw when I was a student, or not, or whether they're rebuilding, they play us tough. Okay? That's a tough game. Penn State on the road, it sounds like they've got an maybe one of the most talented teams they've had, Steve, as far as I know. That'll be really tough. So I do expect, it's really hard, guys, to win every game. It's really hard. And forget, Jake Moody's gone. Like, Jake Moody really helped us win a few really tight games that we weren't expecting over the last couple of years. We had our incident with Nebraska where we got a late fumble and absolutely escaped that game. Fantastic catch by Eric All and play really got us out of that Penn State game. It's hard to win every game. I think it's going to come down to Ohio State, and I think that will settle the East champion and ultimately probably the Big Ten champ. Wouldn't be surprised if we see Cade McNamara in Iowa in the championship game.
That would be something. Cade McNamara has not really participated a whole lot. He didn't participate in the spring. And then he got injured on a kind of a freakish non-contact injury with his quad. They call it a soft tissue thing.
He's got, what does Harbaugh say? He's working on a thing.
He's working through some things.
He's working through some things, which I think should be a new helmet sticker. They have all those special helmet stickers. Worked, like after he's through it, worked through a thing or something, and then you get that little sticker. You're
WTST.
Back. Yeah, that's it.
WTST.
So
I had to think about that for a moment.
Aaron Bills and the graphics people down at Schembecker Hall, get those going. I'd love to see that out there. I think
Put a sticker on somebody's thigh.
I'm a nerd. I keep track of all the different variations of helmet stickers. You can see them on invictors.com, and I forget at what last count was for how many different variations are there. But I think it's approaching 30 different variations of the helmet stickers of meaning. Right, of meaning. There's many that count down the different wins. But, yeah, we're actually at 27, Steve. The last one is Harbaugh created a new one called the Enthusiasm Unknown to Mankind sticker, EUTM, which we're going to see for the first time on Saturday.
Nice.
I can feel it in my plums, Steve. I can feel it, Ms., in my plums.
I can feel it deep down my plums to the farmer's market.
One thing I got to tell you about Penn State is Penn State's probably got their best offensive line that they have ever had in the James Franklin era, probably the best since the Joe Paterno era. And then about James Franklin himself, James Franklin didn't cost his team a game last year, which is about the first time you could say that about a James Franklin team. He actually wasn't responsible for a loss for the first time. Had a great win in the Rose Bowl, and they think this is their year. Penn State people think this is our best opportunity. Michigan thinks that they may have their best team, and Ohio State is actually coming into this season go, excuse me, look at us, the most dominant team of the last 15 years here in the Big Ten. Don't forget about us. It's going to be a great 3-team race. And then, of course, you got to beat somebody out in the West, but that seems to be kind of written in stone already. But
it does.
Maybe not. Maybe not. When we come back, we're going to talk with Jim Brandstatter, longtime voice of Michigan football, who hung up the vocal cords last year, but he's going to talk to us about his new audiobook, talk about the Michigan team, because I'm certainly sure that he has not forgotten about Michigan football. We'll be talking to him as Fantastic Friday continues here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. Welcome back to Fantastic Friday here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. I'm Steve Clark. Greg Dooley is joining us as well. We are the Professor and the Pundit podcast. You can get that podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We release it on Wednesday mornings. We just started up in May, and it's been absolutely fantastic. And speaking of Fantastic Friday, another guy who fits into that fantastic category, Greg, is our next guest on the line now, a Michigan man, if there ever was one. An all-Big Ten tackle that played for Bo Schembechler's first teams, 2 Rose Bowl appearances, but it didn't end there for him. He hosted Michigan Replay, a review and preview of Michigan football games throughout the season for decades, and with multiple head coaches. Jim Brandstatter would become the Michigan radio color commentator next to Frank Beckman and eventually shift to play-by-play with the legendary Dan Deerdorf. And let's not forget, he did the Lions games for over 30 years as well. Jim's got a new audiobook called The Voices of Michigan Stadium, U of M Wolverine football history told by the legends who made it. Jim, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Steve. Good to be with you guys.
Happy to have you. And let's talk a little bit about this audiobook, because I was looking at it through Amazon. This is just not moments in time that were done by you and Frank and Dan, but it's moments from players, and not recently, but yesteryear, yesteryear.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's become timeless. I didn't realize that when we kind of put the project together, but it's become timeless in that, you want to know a little of the history of this great program. We pride ourselves on the tradition of Michigan football. Well, this book actually talks to those who made the tradition, including, I've got the voice of the man who scored the first touchdown ever at Michigan Stadium,
Kip Taylor.
Exactly.
In unison.
He tells me the story of scoring that touchdown. I did the interview way back when he was 94 years old, around the year 2000. And those are just part of what's going on. I've got Forrest Evashevsky. I've got Ron Kramer. And I didn't realize it, but it has become kind of a history lesson, a history book. And to hear their voices, including Bo Schembechler, talking about some of the great wins and great controversies and great stories during his years, just hearing his voice absolutely gives you goosebumps. And that's what I think the beauty of the book is. And I'm glad we're talking about it, because I think every Michigan fan who appreciates the history and tradition of this program should kind of go back and hear the great voices, like the Ron Johnsons of back in the 60s and Bump Elliott's, and hear the voices of those players who really were the foundation of the tradition that we see today at Michigan Stadium.
Jim, tell us more about, because some of us are just too young, tell us about Ron Kramer and what he did at Michigan and his influence in Michigan and the personality that he was after his playing days. He made himself present. He made himself present in Ann Arbor and around you and others.
Oh, he was unbelievable. First of all, probably the greatest athlete maybe Michigan's ever seen. I mean, think about this. This guy was an All-American tight end, Michigan's best football player in offense and defense. He also led the Big Ten Conference in scoring in basketball and rebounds. He was a track performer. He would actually go to football practice, come over after football practice, go to Ferry Field for the track team, high jump and throw the shot, and win a track meet with those points. That was Ron Kramer. but more than anything, this guy loved Michigan. He loved what Michigan gave to him, and he gave it back. This guy went on to win Super Bowls and National Football League championships with Vince Lombardi. And yet when Ron Kramer came back, he came back to Michigan, and he was always around the football program, loved the kids that played it, and actually at one point delivered apples to the kids, the football team. He would bring a couple of bushels of apples and drop them off outside the locker room door. And the reason he did it is because when he was playing back in the 50s, there was a guy that did that for his teams. And he just felt, I'd like to carry on that tradition. And if you'll notice, there's a bunch of numbers that are retired at Michigan. Well, one of them is number 87, and that was Ron Kramer. That doesn't tell you what kind of player he was. Then you've missed the whole point.
No,
he
that's
was
wonderful.
Just a fabulous, fabulous guy. Loved Michigan right to his last dying day, and just didn't give it lip service. I mean, he was for real in his love of Michigan. That's why I loved him, and he loved Michigan, and he loved everything about it. And all the new coaches, he would introduce himself to everybody that came in, and they all knew him. I'll never forget when Bo met him, and of course Kramer and Bo had a great relationship. After about, I think the first 10 minutes, Bo would go to an event or something after he met him, and he would introduce Ron. He wouldn't say, "Hey, this is Ron Kramer." He would say, "I would like you all to meet Kramer of Michigan." and that's how big. He was just bigger than life, and what a great guy. And those are the historical figures that I think we need to remember, and we need to celebrate as we go forward to the younger generation, to Generation Z or whatever we're calling it these days, to keep this tradition alive and to make it real. Benny Oosterbaan is not just a name on a building. He was a real, live human that, and that was part of the foundation as a player and as a coach of the great, Michigan football and athletic tradition.
Yeah, and you mentioned Kramer. The only one I can think of historically who compares with him athletically is Oosterbaan. That's the only one I could say is in the same ballpark. And and speaking of Ron Kramer, his legacy is felt, as you mentioned, on and off the field. And I can't help but ask, Jim, did you used to attend some of his epic Friday parties before games that I've just heard the most incredible stories of guests and maybe some things you can't have in your book? But did you used to attend those? And any favorite memories?
That's exactly right. Well, I mean, Canham used to have a mixer, if you will, on Friday nights out at his school tech offices. He would invite everybody that was anybody that was coming into the game over there, from visiting athletic directors to players to dignitaries to announcers. Keith Jackson and the great announcers, and Bob Greasy, when they were doing football games, they would all come over. And actually, Kramer and I became the bartenders for the party.
That's it. That's great.
So
I love it.
Athletic directors from all over. The Big Ten commissioner, Wayne Duke, used to come to every one of these things almost. We really rubbed elbows with some great names in collegiate football history. Forrest Evashevsky. Harmon showed up on a couple of occasions, so it was, Canham, of course, loved that, and he loved the camaraderie of collegiate athletics, and Kramer loved it too, and everybody knew Ron. Ron truly was that guy who never met someone he didn't like, and that's the way I describe him. But in his own way, one of the truly greatest athletes I think ever at the University of Michigan, and present day included.
No wonder P.T. Ashland was always in a good mood on the day of the broadcast. He had a great time the night before.
Absolutely.
One time, you may not remember this, but you actually introduced Ron Kramer to me during a Lions game in the booth.
I did.
You did.
Did I call him Kramer of Michigan?
That I don't exactly remember, but what I do remember is that we saw a play, and it was a good one for the Lions, and he gave me like a little fist into my arm.
Yeah.
And I tried not to change my expression, But I'm going, that little friendly little jab, I'm going in my mind, that is going to leave a bruise.
No.
I mean, he was that tough when he wasn't even trying to be.
Absolutely. He was just one of those. He was such a solid, I mean, physically human being, and he was fast. I mean, he was the biggest guy on the field in many instances, but he was also faster than most. In that way, he was like Harmon. Harmon had that freakish ability when he played that he could run, he could pass, he'd kick, punt and placement, and play defense and play safety and be one of the biggest guys out there at all the skilled positions that you can name in one. Kramer could have done the same thing. He was a defensive end and a tight end when you didn't throw the ball, and yet he led the team in receptions and yardage many years. And then he went on to play basketball, and he was the best player in the Big Ten in basketball. I mean, just this stuff is unheard of. And yet that was who Ron Kramer was. And even into his 60s and 70s, if he gave you a shot in the arm like that, you felt it. It
did.
It wasn't just a little love tap, man. He was a guy's guy too. He wouldn't give you a shot in the arm without letting you know it came from a guy.
We're talking with two Michigan historians, Jim Brandstatter and Greg Dooley, one half of the Professor and the Pundit. I'm Steve Clark. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, so Brandy, we're talking about history, and we both know that conferences have evolved and changed over years, but not like they have in the last few years. And I got to know, as someone who's been around the block and remembers the meaning of our relationship with the Pac-10 and 8 and 12, how you feel about all this that's going on right now.
Greg, I'm sure you probably feel the same way if you're a traditionalist and a professor. I don't like it. I truly don't. I mean, progress is progress, but what we've done, I think, is let the money changers take over, and they have now shaped what collegiate athletics is going to be. And so, in my opinion, the Big Ten Conference, we won't, Michigan and the idea of how many Big Ten Conference championships you won probably is going to end in about 4 or 5 years. There won't be any Big Ten Conference. There won't be any Southeast Conference. There won't be any Pac-12. The Big 12, maybe. I don't think there will be either. I think ultimately where we're heading in Division I football and basketball is to a major super conference. And they'll work it out, and they'll have their own governing body. The NCAA won't even be involved in that. I don't think the NCAA is a viable organization to this day. I think they've kind of gone the way of this massive movement of these schools, NIL, conference realignment, media contracts. All of that stuff is kind of the snowball that's basically just taken collegiate athletics, and collegiate athletics is riding the snowball because that's where the money is. And so, yeah, the traditionalist in me hates it because when I came to school back, there were two things that I had. One, I could get a degree from one of the great educational institutions in the country. I had a chance to play football, play in a Big Ten conference. That's all that mattered. And go to the Rose Bowl was icing on the cake. Now the Rose Bowl is not really the Rose Bowl anymore. The traditional, back in the day, you guys are still too young, but back in the day, there was the Cotton Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, the Rose Bowl, and the Orange Bowl.
We're not that young anymore.
Well, that's true, but those four bowls basically, were the New Year's Day. You sat all day long and watched those four major bowls, and they had all the best teams in them, and the national championship was a vote anyway, but it's still a vote, really. I mean, you pick the top four, and they aren't those top four aren't necessarily teams that they're teams that are 5 and 6 that said they deserve. Southern Cal felt they deserved last year, and if they'd have got in, they might have beaten somebody, But that's just the way it goes. But yeah, Greg, I'm like you. Collegiate athletics is not where I'd like it to go, and I'm sorry because I think we miss we'll not have the great traditions of the Big Ten and the Big Ten championship and the Southwest. The Southwest Conference doesn't exist. Remember the Southwest Conference used to be a big conference. It's gone.
Yeah.
What's the Mountain West anymore? Is the Mountain West even around?
The Mountain West is trying to figure out if they're going to be the pack whatever or whether they can absorb the other four that are remaining.
Well, and the ACC is going saying, well, wow, what do we do to survive? Because all we got really is Clemson. So, in a national perspective, they got North Carolina, NC State stuff, but they're I guess, talking today with Stanford, Cal, and somebody else.
I think it just became official.
Yeah, it's
SMU.
official done that Cal, Stanford, and SMU are going to the ACC.
There you go. And the ACC stands for the Atlantic Coast Conference. And both Stanford and California are on the Pacific Coast.
Makes sense.
Now, explain that to me.
Well, Brandy, and I know when you talk about all this, you talk about not just from a Michigan perspective, but, I happen to grow up with the Brandstatters of East Lansing and your brother's family and all your nephews and nieces in that wonderful family. And I know your father's legacy at Michigan State, Art Senior, and your brother played at State. And you mentioned, when you first got to Michigan, and I got to ask, is there a favorite memory either of your time at Michigan or Bo Schembechler that, maybe people don't know about, but you love to share? You love to share to people to get people really what it was like.
Well, there's so many Bo memories, there's too many. But as a player, I remember my senior year going into East Lansing, having grown up in East Lansing, and with my dad on the faculty. As a 10-year-old, I used to run around that stadium like I owned it, because my brother Art was playing for him, and so I was like a 10-year-old little brother. And here I come in, 9 years later, 11 years later, in 1971, as a senior, playing for the hated enemy. And I had one of my better games that day, and we won the game. And I just remember being able to walk on the air because my mom and dad were in the stands, and of course they were and in the faculty section for Michigan State, and they were all fielding questions. Why is he over there doing? And my mom was just bursting with pride, and my dad was, very, very proud of me. Although he was wearing his green and white. God bless my mom; she was wearing maize and blue.
I love it.
But those were that. From a personal perspective, Greg, that's a memory that you don't, because it's personal.
Yeah.
And so that's one that you will always remember. And I remember Bo in the meetings. We watched film of the game the next day. Back then, we came in on Sundays and we watched film underneath. It's a lot different than it is today. Underneath the baseball stadium, Ray Fisher Stadium, we set up projectors and watched our game film, offense on one side and defense on the other. And I'll never forget that, again, I was blocking and we scored or did something, and I got a good block, and Bo backed it up, and 3-4 times when I find, and everybody's wondering what's he going to do, what's going on. And he said, I'll never forget it as long as I live. We were in this, dank, dark baseball garage underneath the stadium. It's cold, and all he said was, "Oh, hey, old Brandstatter tigered up over at his own hometown." That's one of those great memories that I have, because it is personal, and that game is one of my favorites, along with the Ohio State wins and everything else. But from a personal perspective, walking into Spartan Stadium as a senior and being part of that team that won that game and having a major part in it, that one stands out.
Jim, we're certainly enjoying our trip through memory lane, but we haven't even talked about 2023. I just wanted to give you a couple of minutes for you to share the path to victory and the obstacles that could happen along the way under your perspective.
Yeah, okay. One last thing real quick, and then we'll move on. I just want everyone to realize that there's a generation out there that we need to focus them on the past of Michigan football to remember that tradition. It could happen through my book. It could happen through a lot of books that are out there. But there is a Michigan football tradition. They need to remember the names of Tom Harmon, Forrest Evashevsky, Bump Elliott, Bob Timberlake, Bob Chaffee, some of these great names, Ron Johnson, Tom Goss, George Huey, some of these great names of the past that we can't let them die. And I think part of the deal is all of us who love Michigan have a responsibility to make sure that the younger generation at least gets the opportunity to go back and kind of look at a little bit of the history of Michigan and Michigan athletics, so they can come to appreciate what that whole complex and what that stadium means, and what Yost meant to not just the University of Michigan, but collegiate athletics. And that kind of stuff needs to, we need to what do I want to say, embrace our tradition and make sure we pass it along. And hopefully with Voices of Michigan Stadium, we're doing a little bit of that, but everybody should take a part. Now, move on to 23. Okay, here's the deal. Now, I think we're a great football team with tremendous talent. I don't think we can afford injuries. And I mean, we're deep, but key injuries at different spots could hurt you a little bit. So that's one of those things that's always kind of a little thing in the back of your mind. And the other thing is focus. I think each and every week, this is maybe Jim Harbaugh's, biggest deal. And it's on the leadership part of the team and the players themselves. Everybody's, patting you on the back. Bo used to always say, man, when they're patting you on the back, be worried. Because that's when, the knife's coming with the other hand. And that's where I think your focus is really important. This team has shown a tremendous mental toughness to not, listen to all those people patting you on the back and to stay focused. And from my perspective, that may be the biggest thing, because they've got to go on the road and play at Michigan State. And that's going to be tough. I don't care what they say. After last year's debacle in the, what was it, in the locker room or whatever?
Tunnel.
Or in the tunnel. And then go on the road and play Penn State. Those are going to be very difficult games. And don't forget, too, that everybody else in the Big Ten is getting better. And when you are the hunted, the bullseye's on your back. I mean, last year we didn't think we should have a difficult time with Illinois, and yet we barely scraped by with Moody kicking a field goal late. That can happen. And the only way you keep it from happening is by maintaining a focus. Lloyd did a tremendous job in '97 of creating this environment within the team that you take one step at a time. And in order to get to the top step, if you miss a step along the way, you won't make it. So you got to take that step and make sure that you focus on it. And I think that's what Coach Harbaugh, has done a great, fabulous job over the past few years doing that. This year may be the toughest because everybody expects you to win. Everybody expects you to get to the national playoff. That's when you're, I think, very vulnerable on a week-to-week basis. And coming through adversity, fighting it when it goes against you, when you get the interference call, when the calls aren't going your way, late in games when somebody's, got momentum, you're on the road. I saw Nebraska play last night, and Nebraska's pretty good. And we go to Nebraska and play early. That's one that they're going to put 97,000 people in that place, and they're going to want blood because they haven't had a good quality win in 100 years, it seems. That's a tough spot to play. I've been there, and it's a tough spot to play. Michigan's going to have to be on their game each and every week. And I think talent-wise, go up and down the lineup. I think defensively, they're better than I think people. I don't think people realize how good that defensive front is because they don't have the Aiden Hutchinson, but they've got a lot of guys that are hard to block. And I think our secondary, especially at the cornerback positions, are going to be outstanding. So, we got all the parts in place, and now it's time to deliver. And delivering physically is one thing. You got to deliver every week. Every week, you got to be ready mentally for that. That's the only game you play. That's your last game. You got to almost feel like that the game you play this week is the last game you're going to play, and play it that way. To me, that's job one. I think for this football team this year.
The voice is Jim Brandstatter. You recognize it. He's also the author of the book and the audiobook, Voices of Michigan Stadium, U of M Wolverine Football History, told by the legend who made it. And Jim, I'd like to, Greg and I would like to be able to help you to get the Voices of Michigan football more promotion, more discussion, because I do think it's important to keep those names alive and going. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, I appreciate the time you've given me to talk about it, and appreciate all you guys do at WTKA, and thanks so much. And especially the question about that great win at Michigan State in 1971. That brought back some memories.
Right on.
That's right. And, all you have to do, Greg, is go through Dr. Saab's video archives. You can be reminded of the dress and hairstyles of the times.
Fantastic. Go Blue, Brandy. Thanks for joining us, man.
Hey, thanks, guys, very much. And you can get the book at Amazon.com or go to JimBrandstatter.com, and there's a link right on the opening page.
JimBrandstatter.com. That's with 2 T's. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Hey, go Blue.
All right, go Blue. Greg, we will wrap up the rest of our 2-hour stint here on The Professor and the Pundit on a fantastic Friday here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. Greg, I think I could just let this music just play on for the final 2 minutes going into their hour.
Fantastic.
But it's varsity.
It's varsity. Hey, here's a little secret.
Yeah.
I'm efforting the Glee Club to come in homecoming week. When I talk about, by the way, Brandy, all those Michigan traditions and all that good stuff that we experience on game day, including the Glee Club, singing a rousing rendition of Varsity followed by the victors. That's what we're going to get. So I'm hoping they're going to come in and do it live.
Hey, let's not forget the countdown to kickoff is coming Saturday morning at 8 a.m. What season is this? I don't know. It's since 2005, I think, is the first season. So we're getting close to 20 years doing the countdown to kickoff, 8 to 11 a.m. from Joe's Garage. And I wanted to give you a moment to talk about your new endeavor and the new classes that you have going on at U of M.
If you've got a Michigan student, it's open to all undergrads. I teach 3 classes. One's called the History of College Athletics. When I got a review at the end of the year, someone said, you should call it the History of Michigan Athletics. Guilty. We talk about Michigan a lot, but we talk about more than football. We talk about all the stuff off the field. I also teach a new class called NIL, Name, Image, Likeness, and Equity in Education in that. And finally, Leading by Coaching, a leadership class. 2 of those classes created by the great John U. Bacon. And I've got about 200 students this fall. I think all 3 classes are going to be available in the winter, if you're so inclined. If you have a student here who needs something inspiring to take next in the winter term. So
I'm inspired. If I was a student at U of M, I'd be taking it. I'm inspired by what you're telling me that you're going through during the course of the week. So, yeah, take advantage of that while you still can. I want to thank Matt the Miz Misler on the other side of the glass. I don't think he was supposed to be there for the last 2 hours, but he is. He's dedicated.
We
Always
make it
been
work.
there.
It's fantastic Friday. You got to make, sometimes you just got to pull a little extra weight and if you need to. I mean, I've already got enough weight on me, so it works out perfectly fine. But guys, I can't wait until 8 o'clock tomorrow when every one of us are going to be over at Jumpin' Joe's Garage.
Including the goose. I can't wait
Goose.
I can't wait to see the goose.
Well, all you got to do is do a 180 there, Dooley, and you'll see him. Or you can listen after the break and hear Ira and Goose take over for the next hour.
Thank you very much. I was just about to say that. They are chomping at the bit. They're knocking on the door. It's their time to get in to do their final hour before it finishes up 4 to 6 on a fantastic Friday here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA. Professor and the Pundit podcast can be heard weekly on Amazon, Apple, Spotify, all that good stuff. Each episode drops on the next Wednesday. We'll be back with Ira and Goose right after this break here on Sports Talk 1050 WTKA, The Ticket.
Mother Goose, Jester's dead.